Hi, I'm Linda. In addition to being a seminarian, I'm also a researcher and a program manager for something called the Congregational Vitality Project of the ELCA. Just last Tuesday, I was doing a training for new DEMs. These are people who are um, deployed by the church out to help congregations through synods. And I was talking to them about the Congregational Vitality Project and talking about how it is about how congregations are connected to God, to one another, and to the world. And they asked me a question that a lot of people ask me is, well, okay, how do we help congregations be more vital? I mean, we know they aren't vital, at least not all of them, because we look around and there's not very many people here, right? And that's the problem. There's shrinking people. A lot of them are unsustainable, and we have a sense that it's because they aren't very well connected to God, to one another, and the world. And so, how do we do that? What are the best practices out there? You are the one researching them, and in true, I am. I'm looking at lots of different synods approaches to helping congregations become better connected. And the idea is that we'll find these best practices and we'll implement them throughout the whole church, and then we'll raise vitality. And of course, that will mean building a stronger structure because, you know, we understand that what it takes to have a vital congregation is a strong sense of mission, an understanding of God's presence, great leadership, and good relationships. And on that base, you build this tower that is a strong church. But when those bottom blocks get wobbly and churches don't really know what their mission is, they don't really have a sense of God's presence, then the whole structure can fall. And falling means failure, right? I mean, at least that's how it feels in today's society. We're terrified of falling. And so we work. We have this vision of success and we try different things and we experiment. And we bring it all together and we'll succeed, except that we aren't. So often we do things with congregations that ought to work and that they don't. And so I spent a month in January with 4 different congregations in the Midwest who are working together to try and deepen their own vitality and impact their community. They've been working together for 2 years and doing a lot of great things, but it hadn't taken root. And the reason why became clear. It's because the practices and the strategies they use, they aren't just something you can throw in. However, it's all based on their identity, and that identity is actually based on their core narrative. And it's the identity of who these churches are and what they're for, working with their context and their conditions like leadership and relationships and God's presence. That's what kind of forms strategies and outcomes. So the idea that a best practice could be put into any congregation, ignoring all that other stuff, doesn't make sense. Instead, we have to step back and think about the systems that we're working in and how they are moving through cycles. We're used to that in like the environment or even societies, that there's cycles of death and birth, you know, and growth and aging. And a vital, vibrant tree in the spring looks really different from the same vital, vibrant tree in the fall. So we need to start thinking about congregations not just in terms of a one-time, one-size-fits-all, but maybe look at the different adaptive cycles that they're in. This isn't a new idea. Roxburgh and Romanek developed this model. It takes that same familiar figure 8 and it shows them in zones. So starting off with choice, this is where congregations say this is who we are and what we're about, and then they figure out how to actually live that out all the way through the blue zone where they're strong and they've built these structures and they're working really well until they get to the red zone, when actually the problem is the world has changed and the things that worked before don't work anymore, but they don't really know any other way to do it. So they feel this sense of pain and they want to move forward because they have this hope, this possibility. That's actually the Holy Spirit drawing them forward, and in that they start to move. But what happens is they confront a box. They hit their box and they're stuck because their imagination is limited. And when the Spirit can open up that box and show them that there's another way of being, and they let go of their old assumptions, they then wander in the wilderness until they keep moving and they hit the next box. And so it goes, box, wilderness, and that's how you move from the crisis up over through to the choice. It's this constant expanding of your imagination through experimentation and listening and letting go of your assumptions so that something new can form. And so you can see that congregations at different places in this cycle are actually working on different things and focused in different areas. It's really different if you're a congregation moving from crisis to choice and expanding your imagination than it is if you're moving the other direction. And so it turns out the congregations I was working with in January were all in different places. Our Saviors right there was the rock star right now, but they told stories of how only 20 years ago they were in crisis. They had come to a place where their church was probably going to close, but they decided to keep going, not for themselves, but for the sake of the neighborhood. They knew they couldn't do it, so they had to reach out to the community, find new partners, and create a whole new church, which in turn actually created a whole new identity for them. And that is how they came to be where they are now. All those churches are moving through the cycle all the time. And how we work with churches has to depend on where they are. So if you're working with a church that's moving from choice up, then it does make sense to talk about how we build that tower, how we create, add new programs, how we do things. But if it's the other way around, it's about expanding imagination. And if they're in the red zone, it's more about the faithful conversation is, do we keep going? And if so, why? That is a faithful conversation, and that's what vitality looks like there. Because what if God is actually trying to build something different? What if God isn't interested in that Tower of Babel we had going, and God actually wants to break it down and create something whole new? And what if some of the blocks need to come from the community, not just within the congregation? We have to give God space to do that. We have to open our imaginations enough for that to happen. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, it comes down to how we work with congregations, and actually how congregations work with us. It's about accompaniment. You have to understand or even imagine that ELCA is part of this same kind of pattern. And where are we now? I think it's pretty clear. We're in that red zone. We're confronting the same question. We're starting to ask, where is this thing going? Well, we know where it's going, but we're terrified of the tower falling over. So what do? We need to look to who we're working with. And maybe some of our congregations are the leaders here in showing us a new way to form this thing. So how do we move forward? Well, we actually know how. In certain ways, there's steps associated with adaptive change. It starts with discernment, listening to God. It's also listening to one another within the congregation and with the neighbor. But listening, you need to then reflect on that and say, what did we hear that's maybe new to us? And then in the reflecting, you try something out, and it's going to fail because you're going to try it within your box. But then when you reflect on that, you can say, oh, I didn't realize that, and then try a new thing, and the cycle begins again. But here's the thing. Those congregations I worked with, they had been doing that cycle for a couple of years, but it hadn't really enriched them. It hadn't really changed much. And the reason is because of the way they did it. They were doing it kind of like a program, like a best practice, instead of thoroughly engaging it. So I've come up with these 7 I's that describe how to engage these things in a way that they will actually change that founding narrative and that core identity. All right, and so it starts off like this. It starts off with the idea of being intentional, that you actually make space in your congregation to have this happen. It's not just some program a few people over there do. It's something you're engaging in as a whole congregation. You're also invested in each other and in the process, and you expect something to come of it. You have to be intimately involved with one another so that you are part of each other's lives, enough to care what happens, and integrated also in your community, because some of the blocks you need to build this new structure might be out there. So that's a big part of it, doing those 4 things. It also has to have leadership from the inside, both lay and rostered. It can't be something an outside facilitator does. And finally, the most important piece, it needs to be seen as inspired by the Spirit, that you're being drawn forward by the Holy Spirit into something new, and you have to expect that your imagination is going to change, that you're going to have your mind blown a few times, and expect to have a whole different vision in the future than you do now. It's not about recreating that perfect picture of the church of 20 years ago. And so when we ask the question, how do we create a more vital congregation, we're actually asking, how do we fix the church, right? The agency's with us. And as long as we're asking that question, the church is going to be limited by our very narrow imagination. But if instead we ask, where's God going next, and how does the church join God? Then that opens up the church to a whole new group of possibilities. And let's face it, God's imagination is far beyond anything we can envision. Our narrow idea of church, we talk about being a reforming church all the time. We talk about God building the kingdom with us. What is God's idea of the kingdom is entirely different than our individual columns from each denomination, right? Or each congregation. What if God's building something entirely new? We say that we want to be a new creation and that we want to have that life abundant, but are we actually willing to let God take us there? And I pray that we are. Thank you very much.